Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura. I personally love sewing for children because I love to use bright, fun colors and fun prints. Not necessarily colors that I would use for myself, but for children, it's a lot of fun to work with. And I have a project that's going to use 2.5-inch strips. Now we can use leftover strips, we can buy strips in bundles, and in my case, I am going to be using polka dots. Primary, fun, bright polka dots. And this project is just going to pop. The primary fabric does have some white polka dots and some tiny little pin dots. And in between those strips, we're going to have some quilt batting. Now this batting is already pre-cut for us. You can get it 2.5 inches. You can also get it 2.25 inch. Both will be fine. Some are fusible, some are not. Both of them will work. The one I'm using is non-fusible and it's cut at 2.5 inches. So that batting will go inside these strips. The strips are sewn together and we're going to create a rug. The rug designs are from Pauline's Quilter's World. She's a designer out of Australia and she has these beautiful designs that go along with her little sashers. So this is just a little tool that's going to help put all of this together. And you can get all different sizes depending on what project you're going to use. So these can be used for many, many different projects, not just this one. What we are creating are these strips of fabric that has that batting inside. So we need to start with that strip of fabric, and they are cut the width of the fabric, which is 45 inches. From here, we're going to be able to put on this batting. If you have a batting that's fusible, you're going to put your batting down on your pressing mat and put that fusible part facing up. The strip of fabric will then be ironed right on top. And we're going to be able to just go along and press that on. When we're done, it will have those two pieces together. But I have the non-fusible one, so it's going to be used a little bit different. My fabric is pressed, then that batting is going to fit on top. Take the fabric and move both ends so that they're touching the center. And press a couple of inches. We will now be able to take this little tool and weave the end in. Up and then back down. What that's doing is it's holding those layers together in the position that we want. And then as this is moving, we're going to be able to press with the iron. We can move this right with the iron. It's designed so that the iron will push this going down. So we can move this along if it's fusible. Or we can bring it right to the machine, regardless if it's fusible or not. So if you're using a fusible, the only difference is you're going to fuse those layers together before you put this piece on. Now that I have this piece on, I'm going to be able to take this to the sewing machine and sew these pieces together. I want those two folded edges to match up. We can start with the pin right there to hold those layers together. I will now bring this to the sewing machine. We are wanting to sew these layers together, and this is going to hold those layers for us. We can use any stitch we want. What we're looking to do is stitch right along that edge. I would recommend a top stitch needle or a denim needle. We just want something a little bit stronger. And as for the thread, well, you can use monofilament thread so you won't see the thread. Or if you have something with lots of color, use up all those extra little bobbins and ends of threads. Put your needle down, take that pin out, and you can now hold onto these thread tails just to give yourself a start. This thread's just going to give you a little helping hand. But once you start going, you won't need it. This little tool is going to help keep those layers together for us. So when I get to a certain spot, I can line up that batting because I did not press it together. Fold those edges and then slide that tool down so it's holding that together for me. So the edges stay put so I can work without having to worry about that flipping out. Now fold that down and keep stitching. When I've gone so far, same thing. Straighten up my fabric, straighten up my batting, fold in, slide down so it holds it for me. Now I can match and continue sewing. So we now have that one long strip stitched together. All of the strips will need to be sewn this way. Then the next step is they're going to be sewn together. We want to take those two strips and have them go together in the center. So we do want a zigzag that we're going to catch both of the edges and start stitching. Use your hands as a guide and put your fingers down right beside. And that's going to hold those layers together and the machine will pull them in. So I'm not touching the fabric, I'm just letting my fingers sit on top to hold them. That fabric is being pulled right through by the machine. So we've zigzagged those two rows together. Your stitch length and width will be something that you personally like. We just want to make sure that they do hold all of those layers together. Another foot you can use is the walking foot. The walking foot is going to be very good for this thick fabric. We need to sew these strips together, having the strips go in opposite direction. Then our first row of stitching. Sew 2 to 5 strips together and then press and straighten out the units. They will have a curve so you can stretch and straighten and press these out flat. Then you can join the units together, always straightening out one unit as you go. With all the strips together, you might have some lumps and bumps. A good pressing will straighten these out. Smooth these out with your hands and then give a good shot of steam with the iron and continue pressing until it is flat. And let that rug cool down. You can always press the other side if needed, and don't worry if the ends do not match up. It will be trimmed down later. Once all of our beautiful strips are sewn together and they're pressed flat, we're going to be able to cut out the shape. The shape does come with that pattern, and I have chosen the bear. So the bear comes in 3 pieces of paper. I was able to tape them together, cut out the shape, and it's only half a shape. On the outside, there was other shapes that I need to cut out for other body parts, but I'm going to start with this big shape. The bear is in half, so we're going to be able to use half on one side and flip and use half on the other. Because the bear's bottom half is bigger than the top half, you can always just add a couple of little strips along the bottom to make up that difference. So on the side I have 2 identical strips. I just cut them in half and put them closer to the bottom. We will need to cut out this shape, but before we cut him out, I do want to trace him out. I'm going to trace out the one side, flip it over, and trace out that second side. All of this extra is going to be cut off. But before I cut it off, I do want to do a row of stitching inside of that drawn line. So I'm going to stitch over a little bit less than 1/4 inch. That's going to help keep all of these layers together when we do cut it out. You can do a small zigzag if you'd like. We just need to hold those pieces together. Now with that row of stitching done, I'm going to be able to cut out my shape. We do need to put a binding on this rug. The directions have great directions for binding and stitching this together and everything that you're going to need, but I'm going to do a different binding. And that way it'll give you another option other than the one is here. And I'm going to do a raw edge binding. For the raw edge binding, we are going to need binding strips cut at 2 inches. They are on the bias, and we will need that bias so that it can go around those corners. I do have a video on how to make bias binding, and I'll put a link in the description for you. Normally our bindings are a lot wider than 2 inches, but we are not doing any fold over. We do need that binding folded in half, and then we're going to just take that and have that fold go right along that edge. So we have a raw edge on one side and a raw edge on another. The raw edge will fray a little bit, but that's exactly the look I'm looking for. This bias is going to be able to turn the corners and go all the way around. I will be stitching this down with 2 rows of stitching. The first one is that traditional 1/4 inch that we want all the way around. And then the second one will be a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to have 2 rows of stitching all the way down. Start with an end that's cut on a 45°. When we come to an end, have your fabric also cut on the 45 and just overlap it and stitch it down. So we do not need to do any joining. We're just going to overlap that. Where we fold it in half, it's going to line right along that edge. So it's going to be equal on both sides. So that binding has been stitched on with 2 rows of stitching all the way around. Now if you find you have a little bit too much hanging over here, you can just trim a little bit off. Over time, this little edge is going to fray, and that's exactly what we want because it's going to match the nose and the feet. The ears, nose, and feet are made out of a fabric that we're going to turn into chenille. So here's an example of the 2 ears. The chenille is fabric that is stitched together and then cut apart. When this is brushed or washed, it's all going to fray and give a beautiful soft chenille look. The directions will tell you how to do the chenille, but what we're looking at is we want a base fabric and 4 other fabrics. These are going to be stacked together so that the grain lines are matching, but we're going to stitch little channels on a 45° angle. And this little space is a 1/2 inch. What we will do after all of this is stitched together, we will take a chenille cutter, or you can do it with scissors, and we're going to cut the top 4 layers. So we're going to leave that bottom layer, that base, attached. And there's lots of different chenille cutters, and that's just going to run through those channels. So we will need to cut all of those channels apart. So I have that bottom layer and all of those layers cut. Once all these channels have been stitched down and cut apart, we're going to be able to cut out our shapes. Trace them on that chenille, do a row of stitching, and then cut them out. That row of stitching is just going to help keep them together until we're able to put them on top of the rug. When I'm finished stitching these all down, then I will chenille and soften this up. Once the chenille parts are ready, we're going to be able to put them on the rug. The center nose was cut out of that main pattern piece, so we can put that piece right back on, and that's going to give us a good idea on where to put that piece back. So we have his little ears, his nose, and the paws. Once we like the position of his feet, nose, and ears, we can just use a little bit of glue and glue those down. We will be stitching them, but it'll be easier if we glue base them than pin them. You could also have glued this binding on first before you stitched it. The glue will come off in the wash so it won't hurt anything. Once the nose, paws, and eyes have been cut out, we will also be able to glue base those right on top. Let that glue dry, and now we're going to be able to stitch these layers together. We will use a zigzag all the way around those pieces to anchor that together. And he does have a little mouth, so we will need to just do some straight stitching to make that mouth. Once all the parts have been stitched on, we can now chenille this fabric. You can buy a chenille brush. I don't happen to have one, so I'm going to use a nail brush. You can also put it in the wash machine and it will chenille it for you. Chenilling that fabric really does add a lot of beautiful dimension to this rug. And that rug is now washable and ready to go. There are so many different colors and strips of fabric that you can make the bear or the butterfly in. You could do a white bear with a black nose. Glow-in-the-dark fabric. So many different fabrics would make these fun, fun rugs. Now, I made the bear rug for a child, but there's nothing saying we can't make them for an adult. I think the butterfly rug would look great in a kitchen by the sink or in a bathroom. It's a fun project to do. We just get to sit and sew those strips together and then embellish the rug. The pattern has great directions on how to do a different binding and has some other techniques that I have not added. And you'll be able to find these patterns in a lot of your quilt stores. I do hope you enjoyed today's episode on how to make a fun child's rug. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're making next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.